this. So anyone who joins us after this can either catch the presentation on our YouTube page at Los Altos Hills County Fire District, or ask questions toward the end. There's a Q&A. Okay, so a little about your presenter. My name is Jackson Ricketts, and I'm the UAS, so Unmanned Aerial Systems, Operations and Technology Consultant for the Los Altos Hills County Fire District. I hold a Bachelor's of Science in Unmanned Aerial Systems and Applications from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And I've got a little more than half a decade of experience working in the commercial drone field in different applications and industries. I hold a Part 107 or FAA Part 107 Remote Pilot Certificate. So that would be for your certification for commercial drone operations. I'm also the founder of Airmetrics, which is a startup company specializing in analyzing drone data and remote sense data. And I'm also the owner of Jackson's Drones Consulting, which is a small consulting firm and services company. So Los Altos Hills County Fire District. So Los Altos Hills provides vital services to the residents of Los Altos Hills. Some of the services they provide is hazardous roadside vegetation removal, hydrant and water infrastructure maintenance, education, training, community engagement, and much, much more. Geography and demographics. So when we're solving problems in areas, especially environmental problems, or issues or creating solutions, it's particularly good to know what your area looks like. So Los Altos Hills is a medium to large population area. So essentially it's 1,000 residents per square mile, where your average urban or WUI interface, which is wildland urban interface, is generally 500 or less. And so for the topography that we deal with, we have a large amount of residents. Some of the other features of Los Altos Hills is narrow two-lane roads with hills and valleys. And so essentially, just as an example, if a lot of residents had to leave at a single time, it would be quite difficult just due to the geography of the area that we're talking about. Vegetation, or Los Altos Hills is also highly vegetated area, which all these factors contribute together to essentially have an elevated wildfire risk compared to more urbanized areas. So roadside vegetation management. Los Altos Hills County Fire District is tasked with keeping these key roadways clear, accessible, and usable in case of several kinds of emergencies. If it's wildfire, if it's floods, if it's earthquakes, or just some sort of disaster. Los Altos Hills is tasked with keeping these critical roadways for this community clear and hazard-free. Generally, this is done through reduction in hazardous vegetation along roadways. And just managing the vegetation along roadways improves visibility and safety overall. And keep in mind that there are a few specific roadways in particular, which all residents do have to funnel out to get to the main thoroughfares like I-280 or 35, just as an example. So how do we use unmanned aerial systems for vegetation management? Simply, we build a digital representation of the project area, or the project area that we are interested in. We use this data to identify hazards before and after the projects take place. We also use it for operations and advanced planning. Generally, these hazardous vegetation or roadway vegetation reduction or removal projects, they're very complex. You're working with multiple partners, multiple jurisdictions, and quite literally a hazardous area. You know, as you do these projects, cars are ebbing and flowing through the scene. We also use this data to build quantitative measurements around our projects and essentially monitor the environment and the life cycle of these projects. So before we dive into the conversation or into the topic a little further, I thought some common terminology might be the way to go here. So when I say, this as an example, sUAS or UAS, what I'm talking about are unmanned aerial systems or small unmanned aerial systems. Essentially labeled by or determined by FAA Part 107 regulations, all small unmanned systems are less than 55 pounds. Another TLA, three-letter acronym, is going to be GIS, Geographic Information Systems, the science of where. We're also going to go into topics such as artificial intelligence and deep learning, is abbreviated as AI. So essentially, they're just advanced algorithms that are trained on data to perform tasks, automated tasks. Another three-letter acronym would be ground sampling distance, GSD, which is essentially the representation of one pixel on an image. And later, this will all make sense. But essentially, GSD is a resolution or a measure of resolution or quality. Another key word here would be classification, which essentially is being able to classify objects on images. So it's hard to not get into the science of remote sensing because that's essentially what we're doing. USGS essentially says that remote sensing is the process of dictating and monitoring physical characteristics in an area. And at the core understanding of what we're doing is we're actually observing a very, very small band of the electromagnetic spectrum, which would be the visible light span, which is between 400 nanometers and 700 nanometers, essentially your dark blues and your dark reds. And this is where we visually see, we're quite literally physically and visually see with our eyes. But with the science of remote sensing, we can really open that up and see bands of light that we would not be able to essentially see with our own eyes, which basically gives us additional information and additional tools to use when we're doing analyses and measurements and things of that nature. Okay, so let's get into how this is done in particular. So let's say we're doing a photogram, or let's say we're doing a vegetation management project. I get called up or ringed up and saying, hey, we are going to do this stretch of road between, let's say, this intersection and that intersection. When that starts happening, I go into the process of flight planning. We're going to take a small unmanned system with a visual camera, and we're going to take a series of photographs along the way to create and generate digital products. And this process is called photogrammetry. After we go ahead and collect the data, we're going to process the data into data types that we can deal with and essentially work with for our desired outputs. The next step, once we have our data products, is then we throw our data products into AI and deep learning engines. And so essentially what these engines are is they're an automated process that you build from the ground up. You teach the algorithms what to look for, what features or specific pixels in the image are related to what. And so essentially it takes a little while to build these, but once you build these, it becomes an automated process where you collect data and you feed it through, and then you get very, very accurate results, up to 90 to 99% accurate. And then what we do is we take the analysis that we've done with the deep learning and AI algorithms, and then we start building metrics around the data. So we're essentially working with imagery, and I think this is a great illustration of the differences between the quality and resolution. So on our left is a orthomosaic image, which essentially is a bunch of images that have been stitched together and produced a single high resolution image that's georeferenced. Essentially, by georeference is if I upload it to a mapping software, it will position itself exactly where it is on the world. And that we notice compared to the drone imagery on the left, on the right, we have satellite imagery. which has its pros and its cons. But essentially, with the drone imagery, we're getting a very, very high resolution product, which allows us to really differentiate and monitor on a granular level the environment and our specific impact to the environment over time. So photogrammetry. So like we talked about before, there are 3 fundamental steps that we take. And the first step of that process is capturing the data. Photogrammetry is the art and science of creating accurate measurements from photos. And essentially what we do is we fly the drone over a particular stretch of roadway. We're not flying over the roadway, we're flying to more on the right-of-ways of the roadway to make sure that we're not flying over cars or people. These flight paths are in a very specific manner where if you do the calculations, each of these photos specifically overlap with one another. With that overlap, we're able to take all of those photos together. Sometimes these photos, sometimes there's as little as 100 photos, sometimes there's thousands in the case of the I-280 map. And so then we take those photos, and we process them, and then we build 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional data products from them. So photogrammetry results. So essentially the 3 data products that we build for Los Altos Hills are 2-dimensional maps, 3-dimensional models, and digital service models. If we look at the top right of the screen, we see a photo from from the Altamont evacuation route project, and the quality and the resolution that we were able to achieve while building these data products are something along the lines of in the matter of centimeters per pixel. So each of the pixels on that image are essentially 1 centimeter in distance, compared to satellite, where we might be seeing maybe the really high resolution military satellites would be something along the lines of 10 centimeters, where free open source, let's say Landsat satellites, are going to be a few meters per pixel. And so the data that we're able to extract is very high resolution, which allows us to really track the environment over time. On the bottom, you see the rotating model. So that is actually a model. That is not a video, it's not a photo. It's a 3D representation of the evacuation route before the project was done. So what do we do after we take these? After we take the photos, process the photos, turn them into the data products, well, then we run them through our artificial intelligence engines. So essentially, we're taking photogrammetry data products and running them through an automated analysis that we've already trained. AI and deep learning engines can be trained to detect certain objects on an image. So if we look over to our right, we have different examples of machine learning engines identifying particular features in the image. The image on the left essentially differentiates the different kinds of vegetation. Green representing high vegetation, yellow representing kind of grass and so grass and low vegetation, low brush, and then purple representing medium vegetation, so somewhere in the middle. And so we're able to feed these data products through and then output results before and after to track these, to build measurements and metrics over time, essentially. And what's really cool about AI compared to other data analysis processes is that the more data you feed it, the better and more efficient it becomes. And so, we've only done a handful of these projects, but our artificial intelligence softwares are getting as accurate as 95 to 98%. And with that is we can make things very hyper local and hyper specific. And essentially, it allows us to really manage these areas on a granular level, based on requirements and project scopes and things of that nature. So after we do our analysis, we go ahead and calculate metrics. So just as an example, some of the metrics that we can pull out of this data is, let's just say, volume of the biomass. So how much vegetation was removed from the project area. Another metric that we have on here is determining essentially reduction of tree canopy. So when we go along the roadways and trim up the roadways, we reduce the tree canopy. And so these are things that we can measure quite accurately. Another thing is determining essentially the reduction of low and medium high vegetation, and not just for a single project, but over time. And so that's really important is when we have these roadside vegetation management projects, it's not just a one-off and you don't do it ever again. It's continual because vegetation grows. The concept of entropy. And so you have to go back and do these projects ever so often. And so with this data is then we can figure out essentially what our impact was just after the project, but what it also extrapolates to over time. And so that might mean a change in or a change in actions or things of that nature to really get the desired output. So we're moving into the real world applications and some of the projects that Los Altos Hills and I have worked together on. So Byrne Preserve. Essentially, this is one of our alternative vegetation management practices. And essentially what happens here is we have a herd of goats that come on the property and graze. And what they do is when they graze is they actually reduce the vegetation. And so one of the challenges was trying to figure out is, do the goats actually have an impact, or are we just spinning our wheels, you know, and things of that nature. And so essentially we went out to the field, we collected before and after imagery. We identified where the goats grazed to a pretty accurate degree. We're able to extract surface area and volumetric calculations of vegetation removed. And so we were able to precisely predict how much vegetation and what impact the goats have as they come to Byrne Preserve, but not just through the duration of this project, but year after year. And essentially, like I said before, it really helps us track the impact and prove that this is a viable alternative vegetation removal process using goats. Altamont Road project. And so Altamont Road is a very strategic road when it comes to evacuations of Los Altos Hills. There's really only 2 to 3 major roads. I mean, you have Moody, you have Page Mill, and you have Altamont. And essentially you can use those roads to spread out, you know, to the larger thoroughways in the Bay Area. And so essentially we did the same thing. We collected before and after imagery. We were able to measure the reduction in tree canopy, as well as extract the volumetric data and understand how much volume of vegetation we're actually pulling out versus what we're distributing on the sites as in the form of chips or chips. So chips in this case is you take a what's it called, a trunk or a vine, you throw it in the chipper and then it produces chips. And it's a great way to retain moisture in the soil, things of that nature, out of the scope of this presentation. And so, but it also, what this ultimately did was allow us to aids in the reporting and compliance and the life cycle tracking of this project. So if we look over on the right, we have the before and we have the after. And using the high resolution unmanned aerial system imagery, we're able to essentially, we can see with our visible eyes the difference between when they started the project and then after they finished. And so we, on the top 2 images here, we see the reduction of some medium vegetation along the roadway. And on the bottom photos to your right, we see a reduction of tree canopy. And so that would be spacing out the vegetation for increased health of vegetation, but also decreased hazard. This was another cool project we did together. So this was the I-280 project, which we will be potentially embarking on come 2024. But essentially, we created an entire digital map of the project area. And what's really cool about this data is you can share this in your browser. It can be collaborative. You can pull measurements, generate, measure surface area, volume. And so we were having an environmental study done. We were working with a local environmental firm, and we were able to pass this data along to them. And they estimated a time savings of 6 to 8 hours of field work. Just from using and utilizing this data. And when they go out, it's not just their crew going out, it's also part of the Los Altos Hills crew. So it's potentially a full crew. You're saving a crew from 4 to 6 people, 6 to 8 hours in the field. And that concludes the Tech Talk, or at least the presentation portion of the Tech Talk. Does anybody have any questions, statements, concerns? It is Q&A. And so feel free, we can always, oh, perfect, we got a chat. Okay, yes, we will give a Firewise plug. So Marjorie, who has been working diligently with us over the last 6 months, is putting on a Firewise presentation for Los Altos Hills. And if you don't know what Firewise is, or at least a Firewise community, it's a bunch of neighbors getting together and planning wildfire mitigation and basically vegetation management around their community, essentially for better outcomes in case of wildland fire or disaster of that nature. And that will be next week, Tuesday, July 31st, 7 through 8:30 p.m.
Jackson, I wanted to make a comment, if I could. This is Jay Logan.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wanted to just explain to the audience, I think it's important that on the Interstate 280, that what our plan there is we applied for a Cal OES FEMA grant upwards in the millions of dollars. And just to say that in filling out the grant application that was extremely intense and full of data bits, that your photogrammetry along I-280 clearly gave evidence of the need for vegetation mitigation along both sides of the freeway, north and south, and also the center divide, by showing clearly the canopies and the growth in the vegetation that would be really catastrophic if a fire were to come through. And what we're trying to avoid there is cars that are in some kind of an accident pulling off the side of the road oftentimes will start roadway fires, or a fire that's coming through like the CZU fire came through. If that were to hit those vegetation masses, we would be consumed in fire along an area that should be a fuel break. And so by doing this vegetation mitigation, we're going to create a fuel break along that section of the I-280, which is just so profoundly important to the residents of Los Altos Hills and also Los Altos and the surrounding communities. And so the photogrammetry and the drone imagery, as we filed all of our data, really got some astounding responses from the reviewers saying, oh my gosh, how did you do?
Oh, I think you might have muted yourself, Jay. Oh, Jay, we still can't hear you.
Unplug my headset. How's that?
Ah, there we go. There we go.
Is that better? Can you hear me now? Now I can't hear you. Okay. Are we communicating now?
I believe so.
Okay. I just wanted to put the topper on it and just say we're very proud of what this front edge technology has brought to us to be able to better perform the public safety that is so necessary in vegetation mitigation. And rather than just have some assumptions and go out and whack some weeds and say, okay, that was a job well done, we really can measure, plan, assimilate, and better our program and the management of the vegetation from year to year. So that's my little speech at the end of your speech. So thank you, Jackson.
Well, thank you very much, Jay. I'm very happy to be a part of Los Altos Hills.
Okay. Anything else from the team that's on board here?